All right, let's get started for the day. So first, just a couple notes about the exam. I got the exams from basically everyone. We're not going to go over it today because one person had an illness that meant they couldn't do it over the weekend. So as soon as she gets it done, we'll be able to go through it. My hope is I'll have them all graded for you by over the weekend. And like I said, ignore the little number Canvas gave you. Canvas probably told you got something like maybe like 23 out of 60 or whatever. That's pretty meaningless because I'm going to have to go through and manually grade things, add partial credit, and things like that. So I will hopefully have the exams fully graded for everyone starting sometime over the weekend, and we'll hopefully be able to go over it either on Wednesday or Friday. Go through it and see what people did anyone. I know one or two people contacted me, but I want to make sure this wasn't a widespread problem. Two people did not have the Venn diagrams show up for them on the problems. I'm assuming other people would have contacted me if this was a widespread glitch in Canvas, not just a sort of isolated or local one. But at least if that was an issue for anyone else, get in touch with me, and we'll come up with an alternative. I mean, you're not going to be punished because Canvas didn't work right. Canvas not working right is sort of the default condition, I sort of assume. Same thing with the quiz as well. We'll go over today the quiz that was due today a little bit later once a couple people had a chance who are sick had a chance to make it up. So that's just some sort of initial business issues. Any questions or comments either on the exam or the quiz or anything else like that anyone would like to make before we get started today? All right, great. Let's talk about the reductio ad absurdum arguments from last class. I haven't had a chance. It took a little bit longer to get them graded, and Canvas was not working this morning very well. So I sent 4 groups back theirs. I'll send the other 2 groups back their scores during my office hours. I should have time. I'm not guessing I'm going to get a lot of people today. So I should be able to get those graded and sent back to the other 2 groups after class. A couple things that I noted I just wanted to talk about the reductios. So there are the 3 criteria, right? So the first criteria was the reductio argument has to point out something that's actually genuinely absurd. I saw in a couple of people that this was getting a little bit confused. So let's say that person A makes a claim and person B is the person who's attacking the claim using a reductio argument, right? So if you have the group work from last time, let's just look at that first case. Person A says we should cut taxes. Person B says that's absurd. It'll lead to the collapse of society, right? So let's use that as an example. All right. So person B is the person who's making the reductio argument, right? The absurdity that you should be looking for, it's not in what person A originally claimed. It's not going to be cutting taxes. That's not going to be the absurd thing. The absurdity is going to be the implication that person B draws out from person A's original claim. So if, for example, right, person A thinks we should cut taxes, person B thinks it's a bad idea because that'll lead to the collapse of society, the absurdity that's being in the reductio is the collapse of society, right? That's the unacceptable consequence that's supposed to be following from person A's proposal. The absurdity isn't the initial tax cut. Several people were like, yeah, cutting taxes doesn't seem that absurd. And you're right, that's indeed the case. But that's not sort of where you should be looking for the absurdity. The absurdity is going to be in the reductio itself. It's going to be what person B is sort of drawing out as some kind of unacceptable implication or absurd implication or outrageous implication of the initial claim that was being made and is being critiqued. Right? These reductio arguments are all going to be critiques. So they're all going to be pointing to something that's wrong in the initial position, but the initial position itself isn't necessarily the absurd thing. It's the implication of the initial position. That's the thing that's actually going to be absurd. Another thing I noticed, if you want to say, as it indeed did in this example, that this argument commits the slippery slope fallacy, and that's correct, it does. Make sure, just like if this was a fallacy problem, you sort of explained why that fallacy is being committed, right? So why is in this a slippery slope fallacy? It's a slippery slope fallacy because it's highly implausible to think that making a minor tax cut will lead to the collapse of society, right? That's why. So make sure you add in that explanation. It's not going to be enough just to say this argument commits a slippery slope fallacy, or that the argument commits a straw person fallacy. You sort of will need to explain why it commits them. Similarly, if you don't think that the argument commits the fallacy, explain why it doesn't, as if it was, again, as if it was one of the fallacy questions, right? Make sure, when I'm grading these, I'm looking way more at the overall sort of explanation you give rather than the just answer, right? The way you justify the answer is what's important, not so much just the answer you give. I have here a question in the chat. So in this example, is the argument a reductio ad absurdum argument? And let's go back to it. It is indeed a reductio ad absurdum argument in this case. And the reason why, person B in particular, they're the ones making the reductio argument. Right? So it's person B who's making it. They're saying, hey, person A, that's a dumb idea. It's a dumb idea because it will produce an absurd outcome. Now, it's a bad reductio argument, right? And it's a bad reductio argument because it commits a slippery slope fallacy, but it still is a reductio argument. It's still person B saying, person A, your idea is a bad one because it will produce this absurd or unacceptable consequence, or this absurd or unacceptable implication. Right? So these are all reductios. Some of them are just good reductios. Some of them are bad reductios, depending on whether or not any fallacies are committed. I hope that helped. And then we have another another question. So someone else in the chat asked, so the cutting taxes is absurd. It's absurd that cutting taxes would lead to the collapse of society. Not exactly. What I mean by that first criteria, that it points to something absurd, it's really just, would anyone think an acceptable result of a tax cut would be society is going to be destroyed, right? Like, yeah, I know it's going to lead to, I know, if we cut taxes 5%, I know it'll lead to the destruction of society, but, I still think we should do it. Is anyone going to say that? And the implication is probably no, right? The absurdity here, again, let's just go back to it real fast. The absurdity is just an acceptable result of a tax cut is not the collapse of society, right? In this case, that's almost the sense in it. It's more, the absurdity is more just a kind of unacceptability. No one would accept that that's an appropriate reaction or appropriate consequence of a tax cut. If someone were to say, if we cut taxes, it might lead to a decrease in social services, that's not absurd at all. That's sort of the expected result of cutting taxes, is that it will indeed lead to some decrease in the social services. An accepted result of a tax cut isn't the collapse of society. That's why it would be a sort of an unacceptable or absurd implication, not one of the accepted implications that the proposal would have. So I hope that, again, I hope that was sort of helpful as well. Any other questions about those reductio problems? I know I haven't given them back to everyone, unfortunately. And I'm sorry about that. I'll try to get started, try to wake up a little bit earlier. It took a little bit longer than I was expecting to manage the email version of doing all of this. But any other questions that anyone would like to raise about the reductios? All right, good. We're not going to spend much more time on the reductio arguments. They're not uncommon, but they're not one of the more common forms of argumentation we're going to look at. The next three kinds we're going to look at are all incredibly common. So what we're going to start with today are analogical arguments. And my guess is we'll spend most of this week working on those. We're also then going to spend probably about a week on causal arguments and a week on arguments from authority or appeals to authority. All three of those argument forms are really common. The fallacy stuff that we've been doing will be helpful because a common way those arguments will go wrong is by committing a fallacy. We're also going to add some new specific fallacies to these different kinds of argumentation. Today we'll add, for example, the fallacy of faulty analogy. So probably we'll spend, my guess is about a week on each of those argument forms. And then we'll see if we really can keep to that pace. And we'll see how much time we have left to cover a few other things at the end of the semester. So that's my rough plan. Any questions about anything again so far? Or should we just dive into the analogies? All right, let's start up with the analogies. And people can also, we can go back to the reductios a little bit more once I get them turned back into everyone. And we'll try to go over the quiz on Wednesday too. We can maybe review it a little bit more then. So let's start talking about analogy arguments. These are incredibly common. Indeed, they might, in a certain sense, depending on how broadly you interpret what an analogy is, this might be the most common reasoning that human beings ever actually engage with. We use analogies all the time in reasoning about the world. So here's a really common example of an analogy argument. Why did I get a B on my paper? My paper was just like Fred's paper, and Fred got an A. And what's sort of the logic here? The logic here, the person who's making this argument is comparing two different things, right? So you have two different papers. Let's introduce it. We're going to call these analogs. The two things being compared in an analogy argument. All right. So in this case, we've got two analogs. We've got my paper, and then we've got Fred's paper. Right? These are the two analogs. These are the two things we're comparing. And so why do I think I deserved an A on my paper? Because I'm saying these two things are really similar. That's the claim that I'm making. And so since the first paper deserved an A, the second paper deserved an A too. Right? This is really common, and I think we all have a pretty intuitive sense sort of what's going on here. So we'll go back to the screen in a second, but let's just actually talk for a second. What would go into that being a good argument or not, right? What are the relevant factors in determining if that's a good argument? Go ahead. You're unmuted.
I actually have a question about the argument itself. Is that
Sure.
the only form it comes in? Like it's this thing was like this other thing, so why are they different?
Not necessarily the why are they different part, but at
Or
least
why
the
is one
first part of
worse
what you
than the
said.
other?
Yeah, at least the first part will always be these two things are similar, so it's true of one of the things, should be true of the other of the things.
Oh, okay, yep.
That'll always, and so in this case, it's sort of implicitly why you were being unfair to me by making them different, right? But it'll always be these two things are similar, so the similar things should be true about both of them. Yeah, and we'll look at a bunch of different kinds as we sort of go through. Does that help? Does that?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Awesome. Jacob, go ahead.
So would this also like the classic sibling argument, like, oh, she got this, so why didn't I get this? Would that fall into this?
That would exactly, that classic siblings argument would be exactly another analogy argument, right? You
Okay.
should treat, and I was the older brother, so I was always the example case in my family. My sisters were always, being like, well, you let Paul do this, why aren't you letting me do it? Right?
Perfect. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, so this is kind of familiar, right? We're all familiar with arguments like this. What would need to be the case for me to listen to this argument, right? When should I change the grade? Do you think? What are relevant concerns or relevant considerations? Go ahead, I'll start with Robert, then we'll go to Emily.
I think like how similar the two things that you're comparing are to each other would probably determine that.
Good, excellent. One thing that's really gonna matter is just how similar are these two things, right? And we can even be more specific, what kinds of ways are they similar, right? Are they about the same topic? That's probably not good enough. Do they make very similar arguments? Maybe that is good enough. That seems to be a really very relevant, a very important similarity between the two cases. Good. Emily, what were you gonna say?
I was pretty much going to say something similar, that they were actually similar to each other, and also that like the circumstances around, like if you turned it in on time, if you did it in the right format, like, all of that has to go into it too.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think between the two of you, you actually picked out basically how we're going to evaluate these arguments. Because what you added, it's not just how similar are there dissimilarities that matter too, right? And if, yeah, one was turned in late and the other was turned in on time, that's a really relevant dissimilarity that maybe matters even quite a bit more than other similarities that do exist between the papers. So I think those two answers were both sort of hit on fundamentally the two ways we're going to evaluate these arguments. That's what we're going to have to look for. Are the two things that are being compared, are the two analogs really similar? And are there dissimilarities that the argument is ignoring that explains why we might want to treat the cases differently? Analogical arguments are, in some ways, really familiar, but in other ways they can be quite tricky. You can kind of compare anything, right? I can sort of compare any two things and find something similar between them. Right? So there's the classic, I'll use this one occasionally just as an example. Love is like a red, red rose. Right? Can I compare love and a red, red rose? I guess, right? Like, I guess like poets do, right? Like, I guess like both of them have thorns, maybe. Maybe so in that sense, right? Like love can sort of love can prick me and a rose can prick me, right? So are there similarities between love and a red, red rose? Sure, I guess. Are there relevant dissimilarities? Yeah, a rose is something I can give to another person. I guess I can kind of give love to another person, but at the very least, it's not in the same sense, right? So at the very least, different. I can't smell love, whereas I can certainly smell the rose. And what's really going to matter is, given the specific thing being talked about, what matters more, the similarities or the dissimilarities? There's always going to be both of them, but what matters more given specifically what I'm looking at? Jacob, go ahead.
So who gets to decide what's relevant and what isn't? Because you could bring up something that like might actually be relevant to it, and someone else says, well, actually that's not.
That's a great question. I mean, in a sense, who gets to decide? I guess logic gets to decide. who in practice gets to decide, at least if you're engaged in sort of a good faith conversation with another person, you'll have to sort of, that itself could be something that you argue about, right? That itself could be something you'll need to sort of figure out what really are the relevant factors, the relevant and the relevant, dis factors or unfactors. Because yeah, I mean, that really is, your question is sort of hitting at what the central task with these problems is. It's figuring out what's actually relevant, what actually matters, right? And it won't always be obvious. In a lot of cases, it's pretty obvious. In the case of the, the paper example, if my paper was turned in late, that one's pretty obviously relevant. That's a pretty obvious relevant factor. But in more subtle cases, it can indeed be contentious. And again, that's why when you're answering these problems, either on the group work or a quiz or the exam, how you explain your work is really going to matter, right? If you can make a compelling case for something being relevant, I'll give it to you. Because, yeah, it is indeed not something that will always be obvious what is relevant, what is not relevant. Good. So any other questions? This is all very, very broad. We're going to get a lot more specific. But any other questions just on the sort of the broad level with these analogy arguments? All right, well, let's start getting a little bit more specific, and then we can do some more questions as we go. So there's two kinds of analogies. The first kind are what are called precedent analogies. Right? And this example is an example of a precedent analogy. Right? The idea behind precedent analogies is our reasoning should be consistent. if in case A, we concluded something, and if case B is really similar to case A, then we should conclude the same thing about case B that we concluded about case A. Think of this like this idea of precedent. It's actually sort of a legal term, right? So you can think about it in that context, perhaps, right? What's a legal precedent, right? The way lawyers usually argue in court is that they refer back to past cases and say, "Hey, judge," say I'm a defense attorney. "Hey, judge, in this past case, a judge ruled that this witness testimony was inadmissible for some reason, and this is just like this current trial. So you should be like that past judge. You should follow their precedent, and you should rule the same way that that judge ruled because these cases are so similar." And then, of course, again, this being contentious, the prosecutor will stand up and be like, "Oh, I don't know about that. Hold on a second. There are really relevant dissimilarities between those two cases," right? But that's sort of this idea of a precedent, right? Once your reasoning should be consistent, you should reason the same way about what it is you're discussing, right? And so in this case, this sort of claim to fairness is a precedent analogy. It's claiming I, the grader, should be fair. If Fred's paper is really just like this second paper, then I should grade them the same way, right? It would be unfair of me to use one logic or one set of reasoning in one case, a different logic, a different set of reasoning in the other case, if the cases really are similar. And so what matters then is, are the cases really in fact similar? Are they similar enough, or in this case, what matters, what is relevant? Right? What's relevant is the chain of reasoning that led me to my conclusion about case B applicable in the case of case A, or are the differences such that it's no longer applicable? And again, let's just go back to this paper example, right? If the second person's paper was turned in late, the same reasoning doesn't apply. Part of the reasoning of why I gave Fred an A is because Fred turned the paper in on time, right? And so that chain of reasoning that I used to come to the conclusion Fred deserved an A doesn't apply in the case of this other paper, right? Whatever other similarities might exist between the papers or not exist between the papers, right? And again, if you sort of think legal precedents here, when you're thinking about this kind of argument, that's a classic example of the kind of analogical reasoning that's sort of being engaged in. All right, so I'm just going to pause for a second. Any questions on the precedent analogies? All right, good. Let's look at the second kind of analogy then. The second kind of analogy is what's called a causal analogy. All right. Here, what we're really talking about is causation, right? So if case A, if case A caused or is caused by something, and case B is similar to case A, then case B should cause or be caused by something similar. Right. So here would be an example of a precedent analogy, or sorry, a causal analogy in this case. We'll do some medical testing. This drug worked very successfully when given to rats. Rats are similar to humans, so it should probably work on humans too. Right. So what's the causal here? We're talking about whether or not a drug is a successful treatment to some particular kind of cure, right? This is why we test on animals. All animal testing for drugs is an analogical argument. It's all a causal analogical position, right? If it worked on the rats, and rats really are relevantly similar to humans, it will probably work on humans too, right? And again, what factors will go into whether or not this is a good or bad analogy? Well, it'll hinge entirely on how relevantly similar rats are to humans. Rats actually are pretty similar in a lot of respects. That's actually why rats are one of the main animals that testing takes place on. In particular, rats' brains seem to work pretty similarly to how humans' brains work. On the other hand, there are some things that rats are really dissimilar. Right? From what I'm told, like rats process vitamins really differently than we do. If that's going to be relevant in whether or not the drug is effective, then we should suspect it's a bad analogical argument, right? It'll hinge entirely upon how relevantly similar the two cases are. And in this case, what's helping us determine relevancy? It's specifically the kind of causal relationships that we're looking at or interested in. Right? And so if, for example, I'm testing a drug to treat Alzheimer's, right? What matters, since Alzheimer's is a problem in the brain, what matters will be how similar rats' brains are to human brains. The other dissimilarities between rats and humans probably won't matter as much. It won't matter that rats have 4 legs and humans have 2, because we don't think that that should play much of a role in how effective the drug will be. What matters is the neurological similarities. Right? On the other hand, if we're studying how quickly humans will recover from a broken leg, the fact that rats have 4 legs and humans have 2, and they're very differently structured, that dissimilarity quite a bit matters in that case, because it sort of pertains to what we're causally interested in. We're causally interested in this case in what kind of treatments will make the leg heal faster. Speaking of animal testing. All right, so there's a special kind of these causal analogies. There's also historical analogies. They have the same basic structure. We're still looking at causality. The difference in these historical cases is we're just really saying we're using past cases to help tell us what future cases will be like, right? So 2 situations are similar. In the past, situation 1 ended in some way. So situation 2 in the future will probably end in a similar way. Same idea. Usually we're still dealing with kind of causal concerns or causal problems in the historical case. It's just we're especially talking about using past cases to understand future cases. And so this discipline of history is littered with these historical analogies, right? Because indeed, the whole point of studying history is to use the past to tell us what the future will be like, on the assumption that similar situations will happen or will fall out in similar sorts of ways. All right, so I thought I saw a question out of the corner of my eye. Go ahead, Jacob. Hold me. Why are you not being muted? There you go. You should be unmuted now.
So how like what exactly is the difference between historical analogies and precedent analogies? Because precedent also kind of relies on something that happened in the past.
It's a great question. In precedent cases, we're always dealing with a kind of reasoning. The idea of a precedent analogy is always my reasoning in one case should be similar to my reasoning in another case. In the historical analogy, we're really talking about what's going to happen. It's not just my reasoning should be the same about the past case as it is the future case. It's what happened in the past is probably going to be what happens again in the future. And that's sort of the difference. All of the precedent cases, they're all dealing with sort of consistency and reasoning. So that the sibling example that we brought up earlier, those are always going to be precedent cases. It's always going to be, Mom, you should have treated me like you treated my brother or sister, right? Her reasoning should be the same. It would be very different if the mom was like, oh, you got chicken pox when you were 5 years old, so your brother probably will too, right? There we're saying what happened in the past is likely to happen in the future. That would be one of the historical analogies. Does that help? All right, excellent.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
So just so I'm understanding this right, the historical analogies relies less on reasoning, right? Like it might not be, okay. And then precedent, because when I think about like legal precedent, I think of like historical, because like that's how they treat it usually, like in a court system, but it's like less focused on reasoning and more on just events of the past, where precedent is like just the reasoning.
That's right, yeah. It's the claim of the precedent reasoning is never going to be like something will actually happen. It's we should conclude. That's always it's always a we should conclude conclusion, right? So if I'm in a law court, right, I might say, Judge, you should conclude the same thing that your predecessor concluded, right? Because these cases are similar. But a historian is going to say like, hey, if we don't fix that bridge, it's going to collapse just like that other bridge collapsed, right? It's actually dealing with what's going to happen. And that's why it's in the more in the causal category. It's what's actually going to result from this event rather than how should we think about or how should we reason about the event. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that makes more sense, yeah.
Awesome, good. Any other questions with the historical or the just causal analogies in general? All right, let's head back to it. Again, so what we're looking here, just like in the historical case, isn't really that different from the causal case in terms of what we're looking for. The thing that's going to help us figure out what it is that's really relevant is the kind of causal implication or causal link that we're trying to study or understand, right? So let's do a different sort of historical example. So let's do this one. So the Roman Empire, a key factor in the collapse of the Roman Empire was lead in the water. Right? It caused a sharp drop of intelligence in Roman nobles. Right, and this was because this is indeed true. The Romans actually lined their pipes with lead. Right, and of course, this wasn't a problem for the average person on the street who didn't have water coming to them from pipes. They got their water from wells, but the nobles, they had the fanciest, most up-to-date sort of technology, and so they were drinking leaded water, right? Lead water. Surely we humans, we would never be so foolish today. Well, actually, hold on. Our pipes today still do, in fact, use lead. At least in many cases, like, for example, Flint, Michigan, right, where there was a crisis caused by those lead in the pipes leaching, indeed, into the water supply. All right? So we should fear, if we don't fix our current situation, a similar outcome to the one that Rome suffered. So what are the analogs in this case, right? The analog 1, lead in the Roman pipes. Analog 2, lead in our pipes. What was true about lead in the Roman pipes that led to the collapse of their civilization? What should we fear is true in our case? That it will lead similarly to the collapse of our civilization. Right? And that's a good way to sort of approach these problems, almost to sort of diagram them out. First, identify the analogs. And then figure out what result is the argument coming to on the basis of the analogy. Like the Romans did. Yeah, that's too small. All right, so what would go in, again, what would go into whether or not this is a good or bad analogy? Well, it's going to hinge entirely upon how similar our cases are with respect to the effect that, and we can make it more specific though, right? With respect to what effect is lead in the pipes likely to have upon our society? How does that compare to the effects that lead in the pipes was likely to have in the Roman society? Right? That will determine whether or not this is a good or bad causal analogy. Right? And if it's a bad one, we might well suspect, actually, maybe this is slippery slope, right? Maybe, yeah, maybe it is indeed potentially problematic we have lead in our pipes, but maybe it won't be as problematic as it was for the Romans because of special cases that were involved with the Roman Empire that maybe aren't relevant for us. Or perhaps vice versa. Or we might conclude, actually, no, our case is very similar to the Roman case, and so indeed we should fear the same kind of outcomes. All right, let's head back for a second. So again, I just want to check in. Any questions about that example? Any questions about the sort of logic that we're using here when we're looking at these analogical arguments? All right, good. We'll end up with one last thing for the day. Let's talk about how we're actually going to go about evaluating these arguments, and let's just sort of go through the procedure. Right? The difference between the causal. Oh, let me actually make sure. Can I erase this? Does anyone still need this up? I'll put it back up. Give me a thumbs up or something if anyone still needs it. Everyone good? All right, perfect. So, while there are interesting distinctions between the historical, the causal, and the precedent analogies, we're going to use the same basic procedure to analyze all of them because the same procedure is sort of going to be applicable in all of the cases. All right, so the first thing you need to do, first identify the analogs. This isn't strictly speaking going to be relevant in terms of the conclusion you come to, but I can just tell you from experience of having taught a lot of logic classes, people who do a really good job accurately identifying the analogs tend to just do way better on these problems than people who struggle with identifying what the analogs are. So that's why my recommendation, just begin, identify the analogs, identify the things being compared. All right. People who do really well with that tend to do much better with the next steps, the next couple steps of the argument. Step 2, identify how the analogs are similar. Given what the concerns of the argument are. So let's go back to that sort of really straightforward case of the paper and sort of get whether or not I should have given the same papers the same grades. It's what relevant similarities do the papers have that justify the conclusion that they should receive the same grade, right? Maybe make the similar arguments. Maybe they're both really well written. Maybe they both show careful attention to detail, yada, yada, yada. What are these similarities? Sort of list those similarities out. 3, identify how the analogs are relevantly dissimilar. Again, given what the concerns of the argument are. Right? It's probably not really a relevant dissimilarity that the papers were written by different people. Presumably, who you are shouldn't play any role in the grade that I give you. I should grade you based on the quality of your work. On the other hand, if one paper was turned in late and the other paper was turned in early, that is a relevant dissimilarity. Right? That really does matter to how my reasoning about what grade you sort of are owed or deserved on the paper. This third step is a little bit tricky. I've seen people get confused with this before. The argument itself is not going to list these dissimilarities. You're going to have to go beyond the argument to supply them. And this is because the person who's making the argument obviously thinks it's a good analogy, or at least they want you to think it's a good analogy at the minimum. And so they're not going to point out how the two things that they're comparing are different, right? You're going to sort of have to go above and beyond what the argument itself explicitly says and figure out, okay, are there sort of hidden dissimilarities that the argument didn't mention? Right? You know, let's put it like, what is the argument leaving out, right? What isn't it mentioning about how the analogs are actually related to one another, right? For the person who comes to me and says, I should have gotten the same grade as Fred, he's probably not going to bring up the fact that he turned in the paper late, right? He's not going to mention it. To evaluate if he's making a good argument, I'm going to have to go beyond what he's presented. And ultimately, once you've identified these, you need to reach some ultimate conclusion. What matters more, the dissimilarities or the similarities? Also, in principle, it's possible to have more than 2 analogs. So if there's more than 2, it'll always be the case that there's sort of a set of analogs we know and one we don't know really well. So it ultimately still sort of boils down to 2. But yeah. Right. And this will be the procedure. And then this is where you sort of want to justify your work. This is where that question I got earlier in the day about how do you sort of know what's relevant. This is sort of where you have to just sort of make your case, I guess, right? Or you're going to sort of need to explain to me ultimately what matters more, what's more relevant, the similarities or the dissimilarities, right? Here are some maybe helpful tools you can try when you're trying to figure out what is relevant and what isn't. These aren't always required, but they sometimes can be helpful, right? You can try extending the analogy. Does it produce, and if you do so, does it produce any sort of crazy results? Right. So, for example, if I mean, this is it's pretty obvious that this is would be a bad argument. But if the person coming to me about changing their paper grade was like, hey, my paper was written in English and Fred's paper was written in English, so therefore I deserve an A, does that argument, if I extended it further, produce any crazy results? Sure, it could even be written in incoherent English and it would still deserve an A. That's probably not a very relevant similarity, just that it was written in English. Right? Another thing you can try creating an alternative analogy that produces the exact opposite result. Here would be an example. Love is like a red, red rose. Roses are pretty. Therefore, love is pretty or beautiful. But I could also do love is like a red, red rose. Roses have thorns. Therefore, love is painful. The fact that I could use the exact same analogy to derive at pretty opposed conclusions, maybe they're not really that opposed, I guess, but they're at least superficially pretty different conclusions, suggests that the similarities that exist between love and roses might not be that relevant. They might not be that useful. Right? You don't have to do any of these. The book goes through them a little bit. They're more just sort of helpful tools to help you figure out what is relevant, what is not relevant. Right? Let's stop. I'll stop here for a second. Any questions about any of those criteria? I think that procedure should be probably relatively straightforward, but any questions about it? There's one last point I want to make before I let you all go, but I want to make sure I'm not missing any questions on those criteria. All right, great. Let's add. There's one last thing I want to say, and then this will be the last thing for the day. All right. The reason people make analogical arguments is usually because you understand or know a lot more about one of the analogs than the other analogs. So let's just do the sibling case, perhaps, right? I know how my mom reacted in my case. I don't know how she's going to react in my sibling's case. And so because of that gap, that's why I make the analogy. I say, I'm not sure how you'll act in this case, but you should act like you did in that other case that I know better, right? That's how the analogies sort of work. They go from what is known to what is unknown. Similarly, let's do the medical testing case. I know what happens when I gave the drug to a rat. I don't know what's going to happen when I give it to a human. If I already knew, I wouldn't bother with the analogy. But because I don't know, that's why I want to make the analogy. I know what will happen with the rat. I'll go from that to what I don't know, precisely what will happen when I apply it to a human. That's why these are inductive arguments. It's not certain, even if the analogy between rats and humans is really, really good and really, really relevant, that doesn't mean it's certain that the same drug that works on rats will also work on humans, right? There could be some relevant dissimilarity that I wasn't aware of, that I didn't know. I'm just better off because I do know something about what will happen with rats, and I know nothing about what will happen with humans. If I can use what I know to help explain what I don't know, that's kind of the logic here of these analogical arguments. Right? And as a result, there's a fallacy specifically associated with these, the fallacy of faulty analogy. And that's going to take place where the two analogs are just really obviously dissimilar from one another. Right? Where they're sort of transparently dissimilar. Because then you're not actually moving from what you know to what you don't know. But it looks like you do. Right. So add this to your list of fallacies that you're looking for, and before the next exam, I'll give you a whole big handout of all the fallacies, so you get an ultimate list. But this is a new fallacy we're going to sort of add to our list of ones we need to be aware of. Faulty analogy. This is in particular where we're looking at just something that's sort of egregiously obvious. there's a real relevant, obvious dissimilarity between the two things that are being described. Now, what's an egregiously obvious, relevant dissimilarity to me might not necessarily be obvious to you. So there still is grounds for discussion here, but that's what you're looking for. You're looking for not a subtle dissimilarity, but a big, loud, obvious one to some extent. All right, that's what I have for you all for today. I think we're gonna spend a good amount of time on this. So I think what we'll do, I won't give you a homework assignment for Wednesday. For Wednesday, we'll do a group activity. It'll probably, if last class period was any indication, it'll probably take the whole day, and that's fine. Then I'll give you a homework assignment, and then I'll give you a quiz for Friday based on how that group activity goes. So I think that'll be the plan for Wednesday. Yeah, so no homework or anything. I'll unmute everyone, so if anyone wants to ask me some questions now that we're at the end of class, feel free to stick around. I'm also just going to keep this channel open for office hours, so if anyone does want to come to office hours, you can either join this link or come back, or you should be able to follow the same link later, because I'll leave it open. The same room will be open for office hours purposes. Otherwise, yeah, I'll talk to you all on Wednesday. Thank you all very much. And you are unmuted, so if anyone wants to chat.